The summer of 1895 was unlike any other in London. The city pulsed with its usual energy, markets crowded with shouting vendors, carriages clattering down cobblestone streets, and children spilling into alleys to play after long school days. But beneath the rhythm of ordinary life in the East End, a chilling story was about to unfold, one that would grip the newspapers, terrify households across Britain, and leave a stain on the history of crime. At the heart of it was not a seasoned killer, nor a desperate criminal, but a boy of just 13 years old. His name was Robert Coombes. Robert was not a child of privilege. Born into a working-class family, he and his younger brother Nathaniel, called Natty, were raised in a modest home on Cave Road, Plaistow. Their father, a seaman, often worked away from home, leaving their mother, Emily, to care for them. She was known to be strict, though not unkind, and like many mothers of the time, she carried the weight of running a household largely on her own. But Robert was not like other boys his age. His mind, by all accounts, seemed drawn to darker places. What fascinated Robert most were not school books, games, or the laughter of his peers, but the lurid, penny dreadfuls that circulated widely in London. These cheaply printed stories, sold for just a penny, were filled with sensational tales of murders, criminals, and supernatural horrors. For adults, they were guilty entertainments. For a young boy, they could be something more dangerous, a window into violence that blurred the line between imagination and reality. Robert devoured these stories, memorizing every detail of the bloodiest murders. He began to talk about death with the same casual ease that other boys spoke of cricket. By the summer of 1895, Robert was restless. His father had gone away to work, leaving Emily as the sole figure of authority in the household. To the outside world, this seemed ordinary. Seamen's wives often managed homes alone for weeks or months. But within the walls of their Plaistow house, a storm was brewing. Robert felt stifled by his mother's discipline, and his obsession with violent stories had twisted his perception of right and wrong. His younger brother, Natty, looked up to him, following his lead. It was a dangerous dynamic, one boy enthralled by the idea of violence, and another too young to resist his influence. As July began, neighbors noticed little out of the ordinary. The Coombes boys were seen playing in the streets, laughing, and going about as children did. But behind their front door, Robert's thoughts had grown darker, more determined. He began speaking to Natty about a plan, one that would shock not only their street, but an entire nation. At 13, Robert had decided that he would kill their mother. The weeks leading up to the crime were marked by Robert's strange composure. Unlike impulsive acts of violence, his decision appeared deliberate. He discussed it calmly with Natty, persuading his younger brother that their lives would somehow be better if Emily were gone. The thought alone was chilling two boys still in short trousers, plotting the death of the woman who had given them life. On the morning of July 8, 1895, the plan was carried out. Robert, knife in hand, crept into his mother's bedroom while she slept. With calculated cruelty, he stabbed her repeatedly, ending her life before she could cry out for help. The act itself was horrifying, but what followed was even more disturbing. Instead of collapsing in guilt or fear, Robert appeared almost unfazed. He and Natty covered their mother's body with a blanket, shut the door, and carried on as though nothing had happened. For days afterward, the two boys lived in the house with their mother's corpse. Robert's chilling detachment became more visible with every passing hour. He spent money from the household to buy theater tickets. He treated himself and his brother to excursions, even attending cricket matches as though they were carefree boys enjoying summer. All the while, Emily's body lay decomposing inside the home. The stench eventually caught the neighbors' attention, but Robert had an answer for everything. His mother, he explained casually, had gone away to visit relatives. This grotesque facade could not last forever. Within a week, suspicions grew too strong to ignore. Neighbors, unsettled by the smell and by Robert's odd behavior, alerted the police. When officers entered the house, they were met with a sight so appalling it would make headlines for weeks. The remains of Emily Coombes, hidden under a blanket, the unmistakable wounds of a brutal attack across her body. The summer of 1895 turned from ordinary warmth to chilling infamy in a single moment. Word of the murder spread quickly, the newspapers seizing on the shocking details. The boy murderer, they called him, and the phrase clung to Robert like a shroud. Londoners were aghast. How could a boy, a child barely in his teens, commit such an unthinkable act, and then carry on with his days as though nothing had happened? But perhaps the most disturbing element of all was what it revealed about society itself. Robert was not a monster in isolation. He was a boy raised without a consistent father figure, left alone too often, and allowed to immerse himself in stories that glorified death. His case forced London to confront uncomfortable truths, the dangers of neglect, the influence of violent entertainment on impressionable minds, and the responsibility of families and communities in shaping the moral compass of children. The sinister beginning of Robert Coombes' story was not just the murder of a mother. It was the slow erosion of childhood innocence, twisted into something unrecognizable. And it serves as a haunting reminder that even in the laughter of children, shadows can linger when guidance and love are absent. For London, the summer of 1895 would never be remembered for cricket or fairs or ordinary joys of life. It would forever be marked by the chilling tale of a boy who chose to kill his own mother, and the questions his act raised about the fragility of innocence and the depth of human darkness. On the morning of July 8, 1895, in a quiet house on Cave Road in Plaistow, East London, an act of violence unfolded that would horrify a city and echo through history. It was not the work of an outlaw, nor the sudden outburst of a desperate adult. It was carried out by a boy, a child of just 13. His name was Robert Coombes, and the victim was none other than his own mother, Emily Coombes. Emily had lived a life not unlike many working-class women of the time. Married to a seaman who was often away for months, she managed the household and raised her two boys largely alone. She was known for her strictness, a trait born of necessity in a world where discipline often meant survival. But while most children responded with obedience or quiet rebellion, Robert was different. Beneath his quiet exterior brewed a fascination with violence and death, fueled by the gruesome tales of the penny dreadfuls he so eagerly consumed. That July morning, the summer sun crept through the thin curtains of the Coombes home. Neighbors later said nothing seemed amiss. Robert and his younger brother, Natty, had been seen playing outside as boys did. But inside the house, a plan born of obsession and cold calculation was about to reach its climax. Robert had spoken to Natty before about getting rid of their mother. He had convinced his impressionable younger brother that life would somehow be freer, more exciting, without Emily's watchful eyes. While Emily lay asleep in her bed, Robert entered the room with a knife. There was no moment of hesitation, no cry for mercy that reached the neighbor's ears. With chilling determination, Robert stabbed his mother repeatedly. The wounds were brutal and deliberate, and Emily's life ended there, in the room where she had so often cared for her children. The murder itself was shocking, but what made it even more disturbing was Robert's composure afterward. Most children who commit acts of violence do so in anger, impulsively followed by panic or guilt. But Robert's response was different. Instead of running for help or breaking down in tears, he acted as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. He and Natty dragged a blanket over their mother's body, concealing her beneath it. With the door shut, they effectively sealed away the evidence of their crime, believing, in their childish way, that what was hidden could simply be forgotten. But Robert did not stop there. In the days that followed, he lived in that house alongside his brother, while their mother's corpse slowly decomposed in the summer heat. The stench began to grow unbearable, seeping into the air around the home, but Robert seemed unfazed. He invented excuses for neighbors who grew curious. When someone asked about Emily, Robert explained casually that she had gone to Liverpool to visit family. His ability to lie so calmly and convincingly unsettled those around him. What is perhaps most chilling about this period is how Robert chose to spend his days. Rather than cowering in fear of discovery, he indulged himself. He used his mother's money to buy theater tickets, attended cricket matches, and strolled about with an air of freedom. It was as if, having committed the unthinkable, he now felt liberated rather than burdened. This lack of remorse, This chilling detachment disturbed even hardened policemen when they would later recount the case. For Natty, the younger brother, the situation was far more complex. Only 12 years old, he had been swept into Robert's dark orbit. Though he had not wielded the knife, his silence and obedience made him complicit. He played along with Robert's lies, followed him to the theater, and helped keep up the pretense that life carried on as usual. Later, when questioned, Natty admitted he had been frightened not only of discovery, but of his brother, whose calm authority seemed unshakable in those days. Eventually, the charade began to crumble. The smell emanating from the Coombes home grew so strong that neighbors could not ignore it. Rumors spread quickly, and when no one had seen Emily for over a week, suspicion reached the authorities. Police officers arrived at the house and forced their way inside. What they found was beyond anything they had imagined. Emily's body lying where Robert had left it, the evidence of a brutal stabbing etched across her remains. The officers were stunned not only by the crime itself, but by Robert's demeanor. He did not cry or protest. He did not attempt to flee. Instead, he spoke with a strange calmness, even describing the act in a matter-of-fact way. To seasoned investigators, it was unlike anything they had encountered. A child speaking of matricide with no apparent shame or regret. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Within hours, newspapers carried the shocking story. Headlines dubbed Robert the boy murderer, and the public reacted with a mix of horror and disbelief. In parlors, pubs, and marketplaces, people asked the same question: how could a child commit such an act against his own mother? For a Victorian society that cherished ideals of family, morality, and discipline, the Coombes case was not just a crime. It was a mirror reflecting fears about what could happen when children strayed from innocence. The murder of Emily Coombes was more than a tragic family crime. It became a catalyst for conversations about childhood, morality, and responsibility. Was Robert a monster born with darkness inside him? Or was he a boy shaped by neglect, absence, and the influence of violent stories? Could society have prevented such a crime if someone had intervened earlier in his life? These questions haunted the public then, and remain relevant today. Looking back, the murder of a mother by her son is almost too horrifying to comprehend. Yet within it lies a sobering lesson: children are not immune to the influences of their environment. What they consume, how they are guided, and whether they feel truly connected to family and community all matter deeply. Robert's crime may have been extraordinary in its brutality, but the circumstances that shaped him, loneliness, exposure to unhealthy influences, and lack of guidance, were all too common. The murder of Emily Coombes stands as a stark reminder. Parental presence, love, and moral guidance are not luxuries, they are necessities. A child unguided can drift into dangerous places, and the consequences can be devastating. Though the act itself was chilling, the lesson it carries is one of responsibility, the responsibility of parents, teachers, and communities to ensure that children are shaped not by darkness, but by light. By mid-July of 1895, the quiet neighborhood of Cave Road, Plaistow, had begun to notice something unusual. At first, it was only whispers between neighbors, small murmurs about the Coombes household. Emily, the mother, had not been seen for days. Her usual presence, tidying the small garden, shopping for bread and milk, exchanging polite words with neighbors, had vanished. In her place were her two sons, Robert 13 and Natty 12, who moved about with a strange freedom. At first, people accepted the explanation Robert offered. "Mother has gone to Liverpool," he told those who asked. The claim was plausible enough. Many families had relatives in other cities, and visits were not uncommon. But as the days stretched into more than a week, suspicion began to grow. Something was wrong. The most disturbing clue was the smell. A foul, unmistakable odor began to seep from the Coombes home. Neighbors tried to ignore it at first, convincing themselves it might be something minor. A dead animal trapped beneath the floorboards, perhaps, or refuse left too long in the summer heat. But the smell grew stronger, more pungent, more sinister. For anyone familiar with death, there was no mistaking it. Something or someone was decomposing inside that house. What unsettled people even more was the demeanor of the boys. Robert, especially, seemed oddly untroubled. He was seen attending cricket matches, spending money on theater outings, and wandering about the neighborhood with a calmness that did not match the stench of decay wafting from his home. When questioned further, he repeated his story with chilling composure. Their mother was away. Everything was fine. For a boy of 13 to lie so smoothly unnerved those who heard him. By the second week of July, the situation could no longer be ignored. A neighbor, deeply disturbed by the smell and the absence of Emily, decided to alert the authorities. 2 policemen were dispatched to Cave Road. As they approached the modest 2-story house, the odor hit them with force. It was not the smell of refuse or damp wood. It was the unmistakable heavy stench of human decomposition. The officers knocked. Robert answered the door with his usual calmness, showing none of the nervousness one might expect. When asked about his mother, he repeated the story. She had gone away, he insisted, but the officers were not convinced. The smell told them otherwise. They demanded entry. What they found inside would haunt them for years. The small home was in disarray, though not in the way one might expect. There were no signs of a struggle in the living areas. No broken furniture, no overturned chairs. It was the bedroom upstairs that held the truth. When the officers entered, they were confronted by the horrific sight of Emily Coombes's body, lying where she had been killed more than a week earlier. She was covered with a blanket, but the decay had advanced beyond concealment. Her face was discolored, her features barely recognizable, and the wounds from the knife attack were still visible across her chest. The stench was overwhelming. One officer reportedly had to step outside for air before returning to complete his duty. For both men, it was a discovery beyond anything they had expected. A boy's quiet lie masking the brutal murder of his own mother. Robert stood by as the body was uncovered. Unlike his younger brother, who trembled and turned pale, Robert remained unnervingly calm. When questioned, he admitted without hesitation that he had killed his mother. There were no tears, no pleas of innocence. His voice was steady, his eyes strangely detached. For hardened officers used to confessions wrung from criminals after hours of questioning, this matter of fact admission from a child was deeply unsettling. The boys were taken into custody. Word of the crime spread almost instantly. By the time Emily's body was removed from the house, a crowd had gathered outside, neighbors straining for a glimpse of the boy murderer they had heard whispers about. Shock rippled through the community. Parents clutched their children closer, unable to imagine how a son could kill his own mother and live with her body for days. The newspapers, ever hungry for sensation, wasted no time in crafting lurid headlines. Within a day, the boy murderer of Plaistow was splashed across front pages, and the story spread across Britain like wildfire. What made the discovery so disturbing was not only the brutality of the crime, but the coldness that followed it. A child who should have been racked with guilt instead carried on with life, attending games, buying tickets to the theater, laughing as though he had been freed from some burden. For many Victorians, this was more terrifying than the murder itself. If a child could act with such detachment, what did it say about the innocence of youth? The case also raised uncomfortable questions about society. How had Robert become this way? Was it the absence of his father, often away at sea? Was it the strictness of his mother, which he may have grown to resent? Or was it the sensational stories he devoured, tales of murder and crime that had blurred the boundary between fantasy and reality? When the body of Emily Coombes was finally laid to rest, the neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief, but also lived with unease. The discovery inside that modest home had shattered illusions about childhood innocence. It forced London to confront the possibility that evil could emerge not just in hardened men or desperate criminals, but in the minds of children too. Yet even in this disturbing discovery lies a lesson. It is a reminder that children are not blank slates immune to the world around them. They are shaped, deeply and irrevocably, by what they see, what they read, and how they are guided. Robert's crime was extraordinary in its horror, but the circumstances that allowed it to happen, loneliness, lack of oversight, unhealthy influences, were far from unique. The discovery of Emily's body was the turning point in the Coombes case. It marked the end of the boys' charade and the beginning of a trial that would shock the nation. But it also serves as a haunting reminder for us today: no community can afford to turn a blind eye to signs of trouble. The disturbing discovery in Cave Road was not only the unmasking of a crime, it was the revelation of what can happen when warning signs are ignored and when children are left to wander too far into the shadows. By late July of 1895, the entire nation knew the name Robert Coombes. What had begun as whispers on Cave Road had exploded into front-page headlines that shocked Victorian society. The boy who had murdered his own mother with chilling calmness now faced trial at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. For weeks, people followed the story with morbid fascination, crowding around newsstands for the latest updates. But the trial of Robert Coombes was not just about determining guilt. It became a debate about the very nature of childhood, morality, and sanity. From the beginning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with disbelief. Spectators who managed to secure seats spoke later of the uncanny sight: a pale, small boy in short trousers, seated where hardened criminals usually stood. Robert did not fidget or cry as most children would under such circumstances. He sat quietly, his face expressionless, as lawyers and judges debated his fate. This composure unsettled everyone who witnessed it. The prosecution painted Robert as cold-blooded and deliberate. They described how he had plotted his mother's murder, convinced his younger brother Natty to support him, and carried out the stabbing while Emily lay asleep. They detailed the week-long charade in which Robert bought theater tickets and attended cricket matches while his mother's body lay decomposing upstairs. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor argued. This was calculation, carried out with a maturity of evil beyond his years. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The knife, the lies to neighbors, the calm confession, all pointed to deliberate murder. In another time, in another case, the punishment would have been straightforward: death by hanging. But Robert was only 13, and that fact hung heavily over the trial. Was it just to execute a boy barely on the edge of adolescence? Or was there more to his actions than sheer wickedness? The defense, led by Robert's barrister, argued that the boy was not evil but insane. They described his obsession with penny dreadfuls, the cheap, sensational crime magazines that filled his imagination with tales of murder and villainy. They pointed to his lack of remorse not as proof of malice, but as evidence of a disturbed and disordered mind. This boy, the defense claimed, does not understand the gravity of what he has done. He is not a criminal in the ordinary sense. He is ill. Witnesses were called to testify about Robert's behavior. Teachers described his unusual detachment in school, his lack of friendships, his fixation on stories of violence. Neighbors noted that he seemed older than his years in some ways, yet emotionally stunted in others. Even Natty, his younger brother, told the court that Robert had persuaded him with eerie calmness that their mother had to go. The testimony painted a portrait not of a typical boy, nor of a hardened killer, but of someone caught in a gray area between childhood and psychological disturbance. At the heart of the trial was a pressing question. Was Robert fully aware of his actions, or was he mentally unwell? Victorian society was just beginning to grapple with ideas about mental illness. The 19th century had seen the rise of asylums, but understanding of psychiatric conditions was still rudimentary. To many Victorians, insanity was a convenient explanation for behavior that defied comprehension. Yet the Coombes case pushed the conversation further. If a child could commit such a crime, how should society respond? With punishment or with treatment? The judge reminded the jury of their grave responsibility. If they found Robert guilty of murder with full understanding of his actions, the penalty would be death. But if they believed his mind was disturbed, he could be committed instead to Broadmoor, the infamous high-security psychiatric hospital. It was not a light decision. To send a boy to the gallows would horrify the public, but to excuse his actions as madness raised fears of leniency toward heinous crimes. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, tension filled the courtroom. Hours later, they returned with their verdict. Robert Coombes was guilty, but insane. He would not hang. Instead, he was ordered to be detained, at Her Majesty's pleasure, in Broadmoor. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some in the press decried it as too merciful, arguing that Robert's composure proved him fully aware of his crime. Others praised the decision, seeing it as a humane acknowledgement that children could not be judged by the same standards as adults. Robert was transferred to Broadmoor, where he would remain for over 17 years. The facility was both a hospital and a prison, housing some of Britain's most notorious criminals alongside the mentally ill. For Robert, it became the place where his life took a different course. Unlike the gallows, which would have ended his story in 1895, Broadmoor gave him time to grow, to change, and to be shaped into someone different from the boy who had once horrified London. The trial of Robert Coombes was more than a legal proceeding. It forced Victorian society to confront uncomfortable truths about childhood, crime, and mental health. Could evil exist in children, or was what society called evil sometimes the result of neglect, isolation, and psychological disturbance? The case blurred the line between justice and mercy, punishment and rehabilitation. Even today, the trial remains significant because it highlights a moral question that continues to challenge us. What should we do with young offenders who commit terrible crimes? Do we punish them as adults, or recognize that their developing minds may be distorted, but not irredeemable? Robert's case showed that even someone capable of a chilling act at 13 could later find redemption. Decades later, after his release, he would go on to serve honorably in World War I, earning the respect of his fellow soldiers. That transformation would not have been possible had the jury sentenced him to death. The trial and the question of Robert's sanity remind us of a vital lesson. Justice is not always about vengeance. Sometimes it is about mercy, understanding, and the belief that people, even those who have done the unthinkable, can change. When the jury at the Old Bailey declared Robert Coombes guilty but insane in 1895, it spared the 13-year-old boy from the gallows. Instead, he was sent to Broadmoor, the grim Victorian asylum built to contain both the dangerously insane and the criminally disturbed. Many believed this was simply a slower kind of death, a life spent behind walls, surrounded by madness and despair. Yet for Robert, Broadmoor would prove to be the beginning of a transformation no one could have predicted. Inside Broadmoor, Robert encountered a world far removed from the streets of Plaistow. Gone were the penny dreadfuls and cricket matches, the distractions of childhood. In their place were strict routines, endless supervision, and a community of men whose lives had been consumed by violence, delusion, and crime. At first, Robert was just another inmate, a boy among broken adults. But over time, observers noted something striking. He was quiet, disciplined, and strangely adaptable. Unlike many around him, Robert did not lash out or descend into deeper madness. Instead, he seemed to absorb the structure of the institution and slowly matured. For more than 17 years, Broadmoor shaped Robert's life. The boy who had once killed without remorse grew into a young man who understood order, restraint, and discipline. Reports from staff suggested that he became a model inmate. He was not violent nor troublesome, and seemed determined to make something of the life he had been given. Though Broadmoor was no place of joy, it provided something Robert had lacked in childhood: consistency, boundaries, and a form of guidance. In 1912, after years of observation and good behavior, Robert was released. He was no longer the boy who had terrified Victorian Britain. At 29 years old, he was a man seeking a new beginning. But the question loomed: what kind of life could someone with his past ever hope to build? Society remembered him as the boy murderer. Neighbors and employers would not easily forget his crime. Yet Robert carried within him something that few expected: an ability to rebuild, and a determination to live differently. That chance came with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Like thousands of young men across Britain, Robert enlisted. For someone with his history, the army was both a risk and an opportunity. It was a world of strict rules, harsh discipline, and constant danger. But it was also a place where loyalty, courage, and service could redefine a man. In the trenches of France and Belgium, no one cared about the headlines of 1895. What mattered was whether a soldier could be relied upon. Robert proved he could. Accounts from those who served alongside him describe him as steady, brave, and loyal. Far from the cold detachment of his youth, He showed camaraderie with fellow soldiers and discipline in the face of war's chaos. In a bitter twist of history, the very qualities that once allowed him to carry out a chilling crime, calmness under pressure, composure in the face of death, were now assets on the battlefield. He survived where others faltered, not through malice, but through resilience. When the war ended in 1918, Robert had shed much of the shadow that once clung to him. He was no longer a boy trapped in the aftermath of a terrible crime. He was a veteran, a man who had served his country honorably. For those who knew him in later years, this was the Robert Coombes they remembered, not the child murderer, but the quiet, dependable soldier who had remade his life. After the war, Robert did not seek fame or sympathy. He lived quietly, working where he could, never again drawing the attention of the law. Unlike so many who stumble back into crime after release, Robert stayed the course. His later years were marked not by notoriety, but by obscurity, a kind of redemption in itself. He lived as though determined to leave the past behind, carrying the heavy knowledge of what he had done, but refusing to let it define the man he became. Robert's story of change challenges the way we think about justice and redemption. In 1895, many called for his execution. To them, his crime was too horrific, his calmness too unnatural. They believed society would be safer with him gone, and yet had he been hanged, the story would have ended in darkness, a cautionary tale of evil in youth. Instead, the decision to treat him, to give him structure and time, created a very different ending. The boy who once destroyed a life would go on to save lives, to fight for his country, and to live as a man who never repeated his crime. This transformation holds a powerful lesson, people. Even those who commit terrible acts are not always beyond change. With the right guidance, discipline, and opportunities, lives can be redirected. Robert's redemption was not born of chance but of circumstance. He was placed in an environment that forced him to grow, given time to mature, and eventually offered a path to prove himself. For modern readers, his story is both chilling and inspiring. It reminds us that while justice must always protect society, it must also leave room for the possibility of growth. Children who go astray, even in the most horrific ways, may not be fixed forever in darkness. With intervention, with structure, and with time, they can change. Robert Coombes is remembered in history for one of the most disturbing crimes of Victorian Britain. But he should also be remembered for what came after. The soldier who fought bravely in the Great War, the man who never again raised his hand in violence, the life that found redemption where none was expected. His story is not an excuse for crime, but a testament to the power of transformation. It teaches us that justice and mercy must walk hand in hand. Punishment alone may destroy, but guidance and second chances can rebuild. Robert's life, from the darkness of 1895 to the redemption of the years that followed, stands as proof that change is possible, even in the most unlikely of souls. More than a century has passed since the chilling case of Robert Coombes shocked Victorian London. The newspapers that once screamed, "Boy murderer of Plaistow," have long faded, and the streets where Robert lived have been reshaped by time. Yet the story continues to echo, not only because of its horror, but because of the uncomfortable questions it raised, and still raises, about crime punishment and redemption. For Victorians, the case was a moral earthquake. Children were seen as innocent, malleable beings, symbols of purity and hope for the future. To discover that a 13-year-old had calmly murdered his own mother shattered this image. It forced society to confront a disturbing truth: children, too, could commit unthinkable acts. But in grappling with this truth, another question emerged. How should society respond? With vengeance or with mercy? The jury's decision to declare Robert guilty but insane was controversial in its time, but it set a precedent that continues to shape justice today. It acknowledged that not all crimes can be understood purely in terms of good and evil. Sometimes they are the result of broken minds, neglected upbringings, and distorted influences. The case became an early example of the justice system wrestling with the concept of rehabilitation rather than simple punishment. And in Robert's story, the gamble of rehabilitation proved worthwhile. Broadmoor gave him 17 years of structure, boundaries, and treatment. Instead of the gallows, he was given time, Time to grow from a boy into a man, time to learn discipline, time to reflect whether he wished to or not. When he was finally released, he did not return to crime. He did not become the monster some had feared he would always be. Instead, he sought a new life, serving with honor in World War I and living quietly thereafter. This arc, from horror to redemption, carries a lesson that resonates even more strongly today. Around the world, societies continue to debate what should be done with young offenders who commit serious crimes. Some argue that children who kill are beyond saving. Others insist that youth itself offers hope, that with the right support, no child is truly irredeemable. The life of Robert Coombes provides living proof that change, though difficult, is possible. But the lesson does not stop at the question of justice. Robert's story also highlights the profound importance of guidance in childhood. He was not born evil. He was a boy shaped by loneliness, absence, and unhealthy influences, with his father often away at sea, and his mother struggling under the weight of strict discipline. Without tenderness, Robert turned instead to the lurid world of penny dreadfuls, stories that glorified violence and blurred fantasy with reality. Without strong guidance to balance these influences, his imagination twisted into something deadly. This is where the motivational lesson lies for parents, teachers, and communities. Today, children absorb the world around them. If they are given love, guidance, and healthy outlets for their energy, they flourish. If they are neglected, left alone with dark influences, or deprived of moral anchors, they may drift into dangerous places. The tragedy of Emily Coombes's death is not just the story of one boy's crime. It is a warning of what happens when the adults in a child's life cannot or do not provide the guidance that child needs. And yet, Robert's later life also offers hope. It demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit, even when it begins in darkness. He proved that identity is not fixed at 13. Mistakes, even horrific ones, do not always define the whole of a person's life. With intervention, with structure, and with the will to change, even the most broken beginnings can lead to redemption. For modern readers, this lesson is vital. We live in a world where young people are constantly exposed to influences, some healthy, others toxic. Violent media, peer pressure, neglect, and social isolation can twist vulnerable minds. The Coombes case reminds us that intervention matters. Paying attention matters. Teaching children empathy, discipline, and responsibility is not optional, it is essential. The stakes are high, not only for the children themselves but for society at large. But beyond prevention, Robert's story urges us to keep faith in transformation. Too often, we write people off when they fall. We label them, condemn them, and assume they will never change. Yet Robert's life after Broadmoor proves otherwise. He became a soldier, a man who stood shoulder to shoulder with others in one of history's darkest wars, showing loyalty and courage. That was not the destiny anyone imagined for the boy who once killed his mother. It was a destiny forged through change. The enduring lesson of Robert Coombes's story is that justice must walk hand in hand with mercy, and that mercy must be paired with responsibility. To simply punish is to give up on the possibility of growth. To forgive without accountability is naivete. But to hold accountable while still believing in the chance of redemption, that is where true justice lies. For the people of Victorian Britain, the Coombes case was a scandal. For us today, it is a mirror. It asks us to reflect on how we raise children, how we respond to failure, and how we balance justice with compassion. It warns us of the dangers of neglect, but also offers hope for transformation. Robert's life is not one to glorify, but one to learn from. The horror of his crime should never be forgotten, but neither should the remarkable change that followed. His story reminds us that even in the darkest beginnings, light can still emerge. That redemption is not a myth but a possibility, if we are willing to believe in it and work toward it. And so, more than a century later, the lesson still echoes: evil actions do not always define an entire life, and the way we guide, judge, and support the young can shape not only their future, but the future of us all.